for joining us in the usual places. I wanted to thank Sean O'Tarpe for coming on last week and talking about psychotherapy and Gestalt. And I'm sorry that any German listeners were for again messing up that word. I'm sure I did. But we talked about Tai Chi. We talked about lots of stuff that we haven't touched on before in the podcast. So it was great having Sean on. We're also over on Buy Me a Coffee as well if you want to do that. And keep an eye out for our deep dive episodes. It's going to tie in perfectly. This week's that's going to come out. It's going to tie in perfectly with today's episode. So, and I'll reveal all as we go along. But my guest this week is an author. He has written Cults, Conspiracies, and Secret Societies, and Isms and Ologies. And his name is Arthur Goldwag. How are you doing, Arthur?
I'm okay.
I'm very glad to have you on after reading your books and being interested and intrigued by both of them. Arthur, we always start in the same spot, really. Could you give us a short history of your upbringing, please?
I'm a product of suburban New Jersey in the United States. The Not an incredibly interesting place or story particularly. The one thing, I don't know how meaningful this will be to people in different parts of the world, but I'm a Jewish person.
Hmm.
I grew up in a covenant neighborhood, meaning that it had the developer had written into the contracts for the houses that Black people and Jews weren't allowed. And the people that were selling the house to my parents, who had to move because of my father's work, didn't tell them this because they were desperate to sell the house. They had moved already and a deal had fallen through. So I ended up growing up in a covenant neighborhood. I didn't know this until I was much older. Um, it became against the law. Uh, there's a whole thing in the US called redlining. Um, real estate people are not allowed to send people to neighborhoods because of their race or ethnicity or religion. But anyway, I grew up with a sense that we were different, partly because we were.
Hmm.
Um, it was anyway. I don't I When I grew up, I moved to the big city, and I've been in the big city ever since for like 50 years. And I kind of look on my upbringing. Well, the the prototypical American is a resident of the suburbs. I've been there. Um, it's not me.
Okay, that's fair enough. I think that's fair. And could I ask then, like, because a question we always ask as well, because it's really interesting to kind of figure out from where people obviously grew up, and depending on their age and their background, and sometimes their religion, even like, when did you first become aware of mental health?
um, I wasn't aware of it as mental health, but my parents were aware of the fact that I was a pretty unhappy child
Mhm.
who didn't fit in well. Um, I always had friends. Looking back on my life, but my issue wasn't that I was isolated or unable to interact with people. I always had a few friends, but I did not fit in with the group,
Okay.
and I struggled in school. I was a very late reader and an extremely avid reader once I started reading, but I was late, and I was never a good student. I struggled, and I was sent to. I saw a psychologist when I was 11 or 12. Then, when I was an unhappy teenager, I saw a psychiatrist. When I was an unhappy young adult, I saw a psychologist, and I would really have to say that it wasn't until I was really an established adult that I started to understand that mental health is a continuum,
Hmm.
and that being unhappy and being ill are different things. And on the other hand, that there are also profound illnesses that are psychological and need to be treated as illnesses. Um, so anyway, I mean, I experienced the challenges of mental health from a very early age and continue to wrestle with them now. I'm, you know, I tend to, I'm a depressive kind of person.
Hmm.
Um, and again, there's an enormous continuum with that. I have never been disabled because of it. I think of myself as a dysthymic person,
Okay.
basically. And I would say also I've had a very long-standing interest in like principled irrationality.
Okay.
Um, the ways that people the coping mechanisms that people adopt, both positive and negative, to make sense of their world,
Hmm.
and if necessary to recreate their world so that they do fit into it or at least understand it, which is, I guess, where my interest in cults and conspiracies comes
Well, that's what I wanted to talk. Like, obviously, there's a few things I want to talk to you about. You did give me hands down my favorite response to an email I sent out, and I tried to explain in a short email about why what the podcast is and why I wanted to come on, and you just said what would you want to talk to me about, and I thought to myself either like, well, I'm not really sure, but it kind of when you talk to someone like over the or not face to face, but you know what I mean, over the monitor, I kind of get the maybe the impression of that kind of, you talk about depressive person. I'm very much kind of in that space as well, and sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes there's definitely an idea of uh like, why would anybody want to talk to me about something, and not necessarily like, I know I mentioned mental health, I know I mentioned that I read your books, and this kind of leads me into the idea of your book about cults, uh cults, conspiracy, and secret societies. But cults is the first thing that kind of jumps into my mind about somebody who maybe hasn't found a path in life. And I'm talking about a younger person, will say, than us, but somebody who hasn't quite found the path in life and can be led by a glamorous person or someone who they might think it speaks a lot of sense. Was that the reason you kind of started reading about cults, or when did the interest start?
um, the reason for the book and the reason for the interest sit in different places. The
Okay.
reason for the book was that I had published Isms and Ologies. I it was I actually wrote the book for Book of the Month Club, and Book of the Month Club sold it to Random House.
Oh.
And Random House, after they bought the book, wanted me to do another book. And I told them a bunch of ideas I had for books. And they said, we think it would be cool since you've done a book about since you've done a book about isms and ologies, politics, why don't you do a book about like fake religions and stuff
Mhm.
like that? And I don't remember how it ended up developing, but I decided that I would do a book on the dark side of isms and ologies.
Mhm.
So it would be, fake religions, and we're not necessarily fake religions, because I mean, one of the things that I say in the book is that every religion kind of starts out as a cult.
Mhm.
Uh, um, and then when you try to religious people have a definition of a cult, which is that it's something that's wrong
Mhm.
or evil. That's not my thing at all. My thing basically is, how established is it, and does it revolve around one person, or maybe a group of people, and does it involve when you join a religion, you kind of give up yourself to something bigger than yourself. And when you join a cult, you sort of surrender yourself to a person or an institution, and you surrender yourself body and soul. And kind of my definition of a cult, ultimately, based on a lot of formal psychological definitions, but also my own feeling, is that it's safe to call it a cult if they're taking advantage of you. If they're
Mhm.
taking advantage, if the amount of sexual abuse that goes on in cult situations is staggering. The amount of sexual abuse that goes on in formal religious settings is staggering too,
Yeah.
but it's not the purpose of the established religion normally.
Yeah.
And you look at a group like I mean, the LDS, the Latter Day Saints, the Mormons, completely established religion at this point. I mean, it really is it's a completely established religion. You can, there's an argument, I think, within Mormonism and within Christianity, uh, traditional Christianity. How different is it than Christianity? Is it a variation? Is it a separate thing, or is it a denomination? Um, but it's not a cult. When it began, there was a charismatic person that was sleeping with a lot of the people that joined the church,
Mhm.
and taking their money and dragging them across the country and putting them in physical danger. And whether or not this guy was a true visionary, I'm not going to say, but the very, very early Mormonism would be hard to distinguish from a cult like I don't know, a cult like Sun Myung Moon's cult or
Mhm.
something. In that the charismatic leader was absolutely present, a physical presence. So and the other thing about cults and mental health is, because of my age, I came of age in the early 70s. I was a teenager in the early 70s. And I turned 13 in 1970, I think. And that was the heyday of it. Was the Moonies, the Hare Krishna people, and you were reading stories about kids, completely normal, happy kids that were suddenly turned against their family, but taken away. They shaved their hair. They wore saffron robes. They were begging in airports. What happened to them? Um, they needed to be reprogrammed. All of a sudden, all this stuff about brainwashing from the Korean warrior comes back into the culture. And, I hitchhiked, because that's what you did in the suburbs to get around. And it was like, don't hitchhike, because someone in a van is going to pick you up and pull you into a cult. And I used to think at the time that that is not going to happen to me, because I have all kinds of weaknesses and fears and stuff, but I don't need a charismatic person to tell
Mhm.
me how to think. And I think you have to be susceptible. In order to be
Yeah.
susceptible, I think you need, in order to be vulnerable, I think you need to be susceptible.
Yeah.
And as an editor and as an author of a book about cults, I've read a lot of memoirs of cult survivors, and pretty much none of them were really happy regular people. That they're I mean, there's no such thing as regular, but they came from an unstable background, or they had some kind of crisis. They Somebody saw that in them, just like a non-religious abuser. Somebody saw that in them and leveraged it.
Uh, there's a reason I mentioned earlier on about how this will tie in perfectly with a deep dive episode I did this week. And I was looking at the People's Temple. I was looking at Jim Jones and
Mm-hmm.
what went on there. And it kind of got me because obviously I saw it in the book, and I'd heard about it before, and I'd watched the documentary before. But we talked about, or it mentioned about a lot of poor people, a lot of black people who weren't welcome in certain places. Jim Jones, the charismatic leader, um, wanted to integrate people, and this idea that that must have been a pretty nice idea for people that to think that this leader was trying to get black and white people in the same place and not to be separating and all that kind of stuff. And then it's one of those things, and you've mentioned about there. Very quickly it turns like to sexual abuse, to drugs and alcohol and all this kind of stuff. And it's just I thought about those people who went in thinking that this was going to be a beautiful utopia, that they were going to, live in San Francisco, then go away to Guyana and live all together in a happy family, and it goes where it goes. Now that's a pretty extreme cult, but there are other, you mentioned other cults in there that aren't, don't end in murder and all that kind of stuff, but they're still worrisome, I think is probably the nicest way to put it.
Jones is really interesting because he starts out as a very progressive, idealistic. Um, he's one of these figures that came up in organized religion
Mhm.
and saw the hypocrisy of so much of it. And he adopted kids of color, and he was had an integrated church. I think he started out in Indianapolis, I think,
Mhm.
or
Yeah.
somewhere in the Midwest. Um, there was a history of mental illness with him. There was a episode where I think he was arrested for soliciting men in a public bathroom. Maybe it's true, maybe it's not. But there's like suppressed or hidden sexual urges. And he's a charismatic person. And like so many religious leaders through history, he drank. I mean, I don't mean to use this expression. I'm not trying to be funny. It just came into my head. He drank his own Kool-Aid,
Yeah.
uh, um, which I would never write that. It just
That's
popped
okay.
out of my head. Um, I wrote before I wrote the book, before I wrote Isms and Ologies. The first book I wrote um, was a popular book on Kabbalah,
Hmm.
and which was commissioned, I think, 100% because Madonna was involved in Kabbalah at the time. And it's like, write a book that'll help people understand what Madonna's about. And Madonna was in a cult. I mean, she was not a Kabbalist. She was in a cult. Avram Berg was leading a cult. He was taking people's money. She was a celebrity. He was taking a lot of her money.
Hmm.
Um, he was using her to get attention and recruits. But anyway, I wrote this book about Kabbalah. I learned about Kabbalah writing the book, and an astounding number of the early Kabbalists, um, they do this incredibly intense meditation and religious discipline, and they go mad.
Yeah.
And they at some point they realize, I know who the Messiah is. It's me. And I think that happens to a lot of people because I think the cult leaders themselves start out trying to fill a hole in themselves, trying to break away from the conventional oppressive ways of thinking, discover this like oceanic spirituality, bring it to other people. It's a huge, huge ego boost. And there's this thing in Christianity, in Protestantism, um, there's this great fear among the early Protestants of this heretical tendency called antinomianism, which is the idea that when you are saved, once saved, always saved. It really doesn't matter what you do. You can kill people. You can have sex with children. God's already forgiven you. You've got, and now some of this, when traditional religion attacks breakaway religions, they accuse them of thinking things like that and
Yeah.
doing things like that. Just like you have Republicans in the United States now saying, oh, the Democrats are groomers. They want children to change their gender. They want them to be homosexuals. It's a lie.
Mm.
But it's also something that happens in some cases.
Mm.
People really do adopt antinomian views. Well, you can't do anything because you're a member of the thing. I'm your leader. I have the, so, you have, going back to the 1970s,
Mhm.
you have these Indian gurus that travel to the West, sell themselves. And you have these guys with, fleets of Rolls Royces and harems of women. They really might have started out as genuine seekers
Mhm.
and made a terrible turn. One of the things that people have is people break, and some people break and they turn into a puddle and they can't function, and some people break and they turn into monsters. It just depends on who you are.
Yeah. There's a you mentioned there about that the spread of information, and you mentioned like some of it might be happening, but then it gets inflated into something different. And um, conspiracies on your side of the Atlantic seem to be growing very, very fast. The amount of them, or even older conspiracies that are being brought up more. It's the idea of Kanye West is an example of someone who seems to have gone off in some direction where he's started to talk about Jewish people, and saying on Twitter he's going to unleash all sorts of stuff on Jewish people, and now he's talking about how much he loves Hitler. But these are just conspiracies roll into something else. But why do you think it is that it seems to have just gone kind of haywire over there at the moment?
Well, I'm I haven't written a book in a while.
Hmm.
Um, the last book I wrote and published came out in 2012. It was called The New Hague. And I was like, gee, since Obama was elected, there's been like a tremendous racist backlash. And isn't it, I mean, the book wasn't just about Obama, but it was like, isn't it ironic that this, huge breakthrough didn't lead to a post-racial society, but to an even more racialized society? And the Republicans are particularly bad. And okay, I'm a left-wing person. And when I would go out to promote the book, people would say, what about North Korea? They're communists. They're supposed to be liberals. And I'd have to say, liberals in North Korea, there's a pretty big distinction there. But you can have North Korea if you want. And I'm still going to say that, that white supremacists are bad. And but anyway, the book came out. It had its cycle. and people weren't that interested in it. And I remember leftists telling me, I don't particularly go to cocktail parties, but I was at a cocktail party once, and a guy that was pretty active in neuropolitics explained to me, if I was a woman, I'd say he mansplained to me because he
Okay.
was very patronizing, that, we've won. This white, these white supremacists, they're as angry as they are because they're demographically doomed and they know it. The country's turning brown. What we need to concentrate on is like getting subsidized medical care through, we have all the rebuilding America's infrastructure. People like you demonizing the opposition are just like, making things go backwards. I could not have less interest in your book. And I took that to heart. And then Trump got elected. And and I had spent, after I wrote The New Hate, I spent a few years writing and doing, I guess it was reporting for the Southern Poverty Law Center. But one of the things I did is I would go to neo-Nazi meetings and John Birch Society meetings and so on. And
Oh.
actually, I never got credentialized because they would have just said no.
Mhm.
I signed up, and it was awkward because these weren't big groups. And it was 50 people in a hotel or some kind of public space. I went. He's probably not famous in Europe, but he was famous in America for a while. Richard Spencer. He's in,
Oh yeah, we know him, all right.
I went to see one of his groups, and I mean, there were like 50 people there. And it was like so clear that I wasn't one of them because they kind of all knew each other. um, but anyway, then Trump comes along and he kind of co opted everything they were doing. These guys all thought that they were going to get famous
Hmm.
and they were going to be invited into the government. He didn't need them. I got involved with, I covered men's rights. Uh, and there were these pretty nasty misogynist groups. Um, I went to a meeting in Detroit that got canceled a bunch of times because they got kicked out of their venues. And I finally get there, and again, it's like 50 unhappy people. I felt sorry for everybody. Trump comes along, and it's like, who needs these people now?
Hmm.
We have Trump. So he was actually, I mean, on the one hand, he was very, very good for white supremacism and very, very good but he was bad for those early leaders.
Mm. That's interesting about those early leaders who were because we've heard of Richard Spencer. I think he turned up in Britain at one point, and but the idea that they were just pushed aside, and everybody wants to be famous, and everybody wanted to ride. Well, those people wanted to ride on the back of Trump's coattails. He really from the outside looking in, I guess. I talked to my dad a lot about it, and he's very interested in American politics and very interested in what Trump was doing. He would not be a fan of Donald Trump. I'll just say that much. I won't go into what he said about him, but he would not be a fan of him. But like you talk, like in isms and ologies, there seems to be a lot of presidents from maybe 150, 200 years ago that have isms afterwards. And I was kind of thinking, is there Obamaism and is there such and such ism? But then Trumpism seems to be the biggest ism of all. Almost like he should have, like, obviously he's had plenty of books written about him, but the Trumpism idea, it came from everything he said and everything he did. We were so flooded over here with Donald Trump. We'd never seen the like of it. An American president every day was in the news, and all these little Trumpisms that was coming out of his mouth for the most part. Um, for you as a writer and someone who is left leaning, how damaging is that on your psyche and on the psyche of the country in general?
Well, setting me aside, well, I'll tell you a story. It's
Mhm.
kind of interesting because I'm an American. I've only been in England once, and I was there on vacation with my wife, and and it was a great trip. We had a wonderful time, but we landed in London the day after the Brexit vote,
Oh,
and people were absolutely shell shocked. And we walked around. We went to a couple very ad hoc demonstrations near Westminster, and I listened to people talking, and they were just. I heard that there was this one guy who looked like he was a barrister or something, a middle-aged guy in a beautiful suit, and he just kept saying, "My England, my England." And anyway, we were walking along the Thames, and I looked down, and an artist had made out of sand on the riverbank a sculpture of a fat, naked Donald Trump out of sand. It was beautiful. You could tell it was him. And it looks sort of like that Trump baby balloon
mm,
except it was made out of sand. And just like freeze that image. And when was the Brexit vote? It was in the summer.
hmm
It was in July or something. Anyway, 3 months later, Trump wins the election in the United States. And I'm walking around the streets of my Brooklyn the next day, and I'm looking at the expressions on people's faces. And it was exactly like those people in London after the Brexit vote. It was like, what happened? Now, if you look at these things in a broad perspective, which I do, and it's what I did in my book, The New Hate, the whole point of my book, The New Hate, was that there's nothing new about this.
hmm
We're talking about it like it's this new thing, but basically every 10 years in American history and in the history of many other countries, there's an upwelling. And we in America, the first McCarthy McCarthyism is this thing in America in the 1950s where they were looking for communists everywhere. And then there were some communists. There were some communist spies, but everybody wasn't a communist.
hmm
But people use this as they called it a witch hunt. Well, we really had witch hunts in America. Um, we and they really had witch hunts in Europe all over the place. I mean, these are real things. Um, it's not just a metaphor. These things happen. In America, there was a huge panic about secret societies in the 1790s. They were afraid of the Illuminati. People still write about the Illuminati. 'Cause one of the lessons of this is not just that these things always happen, but that when people write about them, when what I call conspiracists, when people come out with books saying, everything in the world is really a conspiracy and here's how it works.
mm
There's nothing new about what they're saying. They're literally cutting and pasting from the same books. Um, so there was this Illuminati panic. There was a Mason panic in the 1820s and early 30s. There was even an anti-Mason political party. Then there was this movement after the Civil War. There was a very long, 30-year-long depression in America that comes at the same time as the Gilded Age. And if you don't read your history carefully, if you only read one book, you might just read about the rich robber barons and think it was a really prosperous era. But when you have lots and lots of billionaires, you have many, many more people that are poor because income inequality it's kind of zero sum.
Yeah.
Um, there's this terrible depression, and the farmers are the worst hit by it. And there's a political movement in America called populism, which is what we're talking about now all over the world. Um, Populism starts out with the typical populist premise is that the real people that produce, the farmers that produce food, the factory workers that make things that you can use, they're being squeezed from the bottom by poor people and immigrants that just take, and by rich people and middlemen that just take. And and then this amazing document appears right at the turn of the 20th century called the Protocols of the Elders of Zion that explains everything. It's the Jews. Ever since they killed Jesus, they've been plotting to destroy Christendom. And the way they do it is by billionaire Jews are weaponizing poor people. And they're using poor people. The poor people, they don't really have any power, but they're taking stuff from you. They have the power to take things from you. And what they want to do is destroy what you have. So populism starts out as a response to very real injustices, very real inequities, very real systemic problems. And it basically turns the people that might want to do something about this against each other to make sure that they don't. And this is, I mean, that's what's happening, and it's what Trumpism is. It's just populism. And but what I will say that's incredibly different in our age is that we don't have gatekeepers anymore. Not that the gatekeepers are always great. The big institutional news services, and they slant the news. It's biased to the people that own the newspapers. It always has been. But if you're if you're a clever neo-Nazi like Richard Spencer, you can throw together a TV show or whatever, and you can reach hundreds of thousands of people. And your production values, if you're Alex Jones with his crappy little local TV show in Texas, it started, it was a joke in the early days. College kids would get stoned and watch Alex Jones on public access TV. Then with the internet, he's able to reach so many more people. And so what we have now is the craziness is really, really amplified. And the idea of a character like Trump, who's very, very rich and has no internal governors whatsoever, and he has Twitter.
Yeah.
And if he had a platform from being a TV star and a celebrity, I mean, if I wanted to start a cult, I wouldn't know how to do it. First of all, I mean, nobody would want to join my cult. But if I got on TV somehow, and if they decided to make a reality TV show about me or something, and the premise of the show is how uninteresting I am, it doesn't matter. I would have a big enough audience that I could build something. And so these ideas really aren't new, but they're so much louder than they used to be, and they're so much more self-reinforcing. And if you are not mentally well, if you are not financially well, if you are not emotionally well, it provides meaning, purpose, community. I went to a Trump rally a couple months ago because I'm writing this book about Trumpism. I thought I should see it for myself. What does it look like? And what I found was that Trump himself was thrillingly charismatic for about 30 seconds
Okay.
and then unbelievably boring.
Okay.
And what the crowd it wasn't as many people as he said it was, but it was a significant number of people. It was a minor league hockey stadium, held maybe 9,000 people, and maybe there were 8,500 people there or something. It was near capacity.
Hmm.
Um, we waited in the parking lot for 4 hours, 5 hours, because they pretended that it was that hard to get the people inside. I think they wanted him to see pictures of the crowds outside so that he'd be in a good mood. Um, then when we got inside, we sat around for 3 hours waiting for him to show up. And they were not the least bit restive. They were enjoying each other.
Mm.
That was what I observed, is that it was like a big reunion.
Yeah.
And it was all these people, sure, they're victims, sure, their lives are rotten, sure, people are robbing them and the government's irredeemably corrupt and the cities are hellholes and you can't go outside and Biden's stealing everything from them. But they were really happy to be with each other.
Yeah.
And they had community. And that's what I think these things provide. And I think to a great degree, that's what cults provide. That's what populism provides. And it's what conspiracy theories provide. Um, Alex Jones says a lot of crazy things, but if you decide to get on board, um, then you're smarter than your parents. You're smarter than
Hmm.
the other people that you work with because you know the real story. It's the same thing if you like decide that you're going to be a communist or you're going to be a Nazi or something. You have a new historical framework that just describes it explains everything. There's no reason to doubt, no reason to worry.
Yeah. Why do you think then with conspiracy theorists? Because it's what I've noticed. Say if you do you think that they didn't land on the moon, for example, we'll use that one. Um, but it doesn't seem to stop there. With conspiracy theorists, decided they have to believe all of them. If they believe one, they have to believe all the conspiracy theories. They don't have a cutoff point where they say, "Yeah, the flat Earth thing is a bit too far." It seems like they just have to jump in, jump in the deep end on it.
Um, there's actually lots of evidence from psychological tests and questionnaires and so on that the critical point isn't what you believe, it's what you don't believe.
Okay.
And if you don't believe what your parents told you or what the government told you in loco parentis or what your teachers told you, then you're pretty much going to believe everything else. So, yeah, I mean, Osama bin Laden couldn't have been dead already when they caught him and still alive and dictating what's happening in the Middle East. Those are contradictory views. But the consistent point in that is that the government is lying to you. So it's like once you decide that you're going to accept an alternate reality, you accept an alternate reality. And look, at the very heart of Christianity is the Trinity. It's a mystery.
Mm-hmm.
There were wars fought over the is Jesus really a person? Is he a separate kind of being? Does he have flesh? Does he? How can you be three in one? Is it three separate people? Well, it's a mystery,
Mm-hmm.
and the there were these. I go into it. I don't remember it anymore, but I go into it and about 9/11 conspiracy theory, 9/11 truth, where there's like the no planar view, where
Mm-hmm.
there's no airplanes, and it starts to sound like the skit, like the Shias and the Sunnis and so on, with the with the I can't remember what the word is, but somebody goes into occultation
Mm-hmm.
and the he still exists, but he's hidden, and he's going to come back at a certain point, and it's you have trouble keeping track of all these schisms. But it's just, again, it's the same thing as religion in a way. It's not as deep. I think I'm not like a big anti-religion
Hmm.
atheist person. I'm not a believer, but I think that the religion has provided a context for incredibly fruitful intellectual inquiry,
Hmm.
different than science. It's a mistake if you say religion is truer than science, or religion, is doing the work of science. But, Aquinas is a deep thinker. He may not have known about evolution, or he may not know about nuclear physics, but when it comes to angelology or something, there's a lot of legitimate intellectual work there. Um, they do that same kind of work within the context of these conspiracy theories, but it tends to not be as. There's a great expression from a journalist, a pundit from the 70s. I think his name was Richard Grinnell, but I may not be remembering his name right, where he said conspiracy theory is the sophistication of the ignorant. And that's, it gives you the illusion of knowing,
Yeah.
having all the answers. And it isn't that different, again, than cultism. Um, there's an expert on cults in the United States, Stephen Hassan, who wrote a very convincing book, actually, about Trumpism as a cult.
Hmm.
And I would say, yeah, Trump is certainly taking your money, and he's certainly having sex with people that, or he did when he was younger anyway, that get in his way. But it's not a cult because it's not as personal as that. It's too
Yeah.
big. The scale is too big. But what Hassan said is, no, actually, they are leveraging social media, and they're using mass communication technologies that were developed behind the Iron Curtain and in places like North Korea to really, really manipulate people. And they're collecting data, microdata, they're processing it, and they're sending people very, very bespoke messages through their social media channels. Um, it's sort of, as I'm saying it, it sounds like conspiracy theory. And I think Trump is probably on the way out as a political figure. I think, ironically, people like Kanye West are going to bring him down.
Hmm.
Um, but I can't be that optimistic because I've just finished telling you that this stuff has gone on throughout history. It's going to go on in the future too.
Yeah. There is there's a kind of an anxiety that goes along with a lot of the stuff that we hear and we talk about, with the in the States anyway, with civil unrest and there's even mention of like civil war and things like that. Um, do you feel anxiety about those kind of things?
Well, I mean, yes and no. I think there's going to be massive civil unrest in the
Mhm.
future. I think that's very likely. I think there's, I think, I think for, I mean, I don't think of Trump as a serious person, but had, he, he brought along so many people and so much money, and he released so many demons. They're not going back in the bottle.
Mhm.
They're just not going back in the bottle. This is going to, Republicanism is going to be paying a price for him forever. And I think the party is probably going to be either reformed or renamed, or you know, there's these weird coalitions in America because we don't have a parliamentary system, and we just have two major parties. Where, like in the 60s, the Democrats were half Southern racists, and half urban, Irish urban liberals. I mean, Black people were Republicans for a long time
Mhm.
because Lincoln was a Republican. The coalitions were weird. When the Democrats passed the Voting Rights Act under Lyndon Johnson, Johnson said, "We're going to have lost the South for a generation at least." And he was right. And white people in the South became Republicans. Black people in the South became Democrats. It sort of worked itself out. But we have this thing now where the division, the big division in our politics is education. And I read, this is just a fun fact, that the Trump voters from exit polling, and I think this was in the midterms, they found that the people that voted for Trump's candidates both had more money than other people and less education. And if you wanted to find a Trump voter, you look for plumbers because plumbers make a ton of money and they haven't gone to college usually. So you look in the trades basically.
Yeah.
Um, and but Republicanism used to be, CEOs of major corporations and stuff. And so, I mean, I think we're probably going to have some kind of realignment where the minorities and the poor people end up in one party, and the educated people that are left wing, and then the educated people that are right wing have a party to go to that's just about right wing stuff. I mean, it's going to be some kind of sorting. I can't I can't worry about it that much because
Mhm.
I have to go about my life. And I think during the Civil War, people tried to go about their lives. Um, and I don't know if they knew it was terrible. I mean, they knew that people were dying in huge numbers, but that has been like the state of the world for most of its history. Somewhere people are being slaughtered. Somewhere people are being crushed. Somewhere else they're rising. Um, People were able to live with it easier because, again, there wasn't mass media.
Mhm.
If the enemy wasn't in your village, you could go about your lives.
Yeah.
If the enemy got to your village, you still tried to go about your life, but it got much harder. Um, so, I mean, yeah, intellectually, I think things are going to get really bad. And at the same time, I think, the good news is that, like, I think Trump is we won't call it Trumpism in a few years. We'll call it fascism or something.
That's yeah, that sounds about right. But so then so Arthur, apart from the kind of heavy stuff, say if you have some spare time, what do you like to do with it?
Um, oh, I read literature. I take long walks. I My kids are grown up. I used to like spend a lot of time with my kids. I've got this new book I'm writing.
Hmm.
Um, I'm dreaming about retiring. I don't know that I really want to not work, but I would like to feel like I don't have to work at some point.
Do you
Um,
think does a writer ever retire? And I'm asking because I just bought Cormac McCarthy's latest novel and he's 89 years old. Does a writer ever really retire?
well, some do, but people write for different
Hmm.
reasons. And and I think the wonderful thing about like imaginative writing as opposed to analytical writing is that you get better
Yeah.
at imaginative writing as you get older. And some kinds of, non-mathematical analysis, spiritual analysis. I'm a great believer that people get wiser. And I would hope that if I'm still writing when I get into my 70s and 80s and 90s, although I don't really expect to live that long, but if I did, I would hope that I'm all there and that I'm still learning.
Yeah,
Because I think writing is a way of learning. Um, to I didn't start writing books until fairly late in life. I was in my 40s when I wrote my first book on Kabbalah, and I learned a lot.
yeah.
And I wrote about isms and ologies because I wanted to learn about isms and ologies.
And
And
Arthur, they're exhaustive as well. I can imagine the research that goes into must be unbelievable, really. Because I just isms and ologies, for an example, we're talking over 500 isms and ologies, and you're researching to every one of them. It's like I can't imagine how long that kind of thing takes.
it didn't take that long, and I blew it. I missed all sorts of things. I don't know, this radio show, this very, very prominent, I'm completely forgotten his name, but he was very, very prominent TV guy. And he also had a syndicated radio show. And he said, I have looked backwards and forwards in your book, and there is nothing about racism. And I said, well, come on, I write about the Nazis, I write
Mm.
about this, I write about I, all kinds of racist stuff is in there. And then I went home and I was like, God, what was I thinking? It's an ism, isn't
Yeah, but it's an ism
it?
that I don't know. It's an ism. I wouldn't have spotted that that wasn't there, maybe because it's an ism that we all know. I don't know. That might be. I'm trying to excuse that particular, but it's over 500, and I guess, and like I really enjoyed, for instance, the philosophy section of it, because those kind of things, like the art would be, I'd be aware of some of them but not all of them, like expressionism, those kind of ones. But then the philosophy kind of side of things, I didn't have a clue of any of them, so they were hugely fascinating to me. And when I read it, kind of, I read your books kind of backwards, I guess, because I read the Cults, Conspiracies, and Secret Societies first, and then went to Isms and Ologies. So to read kind of stuff that had ended up in the book afterwards, but then to go on to that kind of philosophy kind of side of things was fascinating. But all I thought about during it was, how long did this take to just research?
I again, if I'm not going to I'm not going to say because it was probably an embarrassingly short time. I should say, I spent decades. I grew old.
My whole
Still,
life, yeah,
but I was pretty professional.
yeah.
I had an advance and I had a due date, and I set myself. It was my job to
Hmm.
write this book, but it was also I really enjoyed it
Hmm.
because unlike the conspiracy stuff, and unlike the new hate, and unlike this book I'm writing about Trump now, it was just it it wasn't terrible stuff.
Yeah,
It was like, oh, this is so interesting how people think. And some of it's very confining. It's like I'm glad I'm not trapped within such a narrow philosophical system. And some of it is like it's remarkable when you do there evangelicalism is has become so influential in American politics and culture, and a lot of it is relatively new. And it turns out that the people that do polling within there are, just as there are like Republican and Democratic pollsters, there are evangelical pollsters that take the temperature of the community and try to define the community. And is it really 40 million people? Is it, well, if it's going to be that, if we're going to define the community, we have to define what they believe, what makes them evangelicals. And it turns out that a lot of the really, really fundamental tenets that make you an evangelical, the evangelicals themselves don't know about.
okay.
Um, they 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 huge numbers of them think that they can be redeemed through works, and that's something that is like supposed to be absolutely non-negotiable.
Mm-hmm.
It's justification by faith by grace, nothing else. And people are like, what does that even mean? Um, I'm a part of a community. And with the rise of Christian nationalism in America, and it really has a meaning, Christian nationalism, here because our Constitution is we're one of the first governments in the world where there wasn't a state religion.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it doesn't mean that every government with a state religion was a theocracy, but they did have state religions. England has a state religion. We didn't. And the Christian nationalists are like, well, that was a mistake, or well, that's wrong, or of course we have a state religion. They just forgot to put it in. But it's this new thing. And anyway, so people are writing now. They're saying, well, it isn't really about evangelicalism. It isn't really about Christianity. It's about Trump.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you want to understand these people, you need to look at the Trump people, and then you find out that that's like pretty much all there is to know.
Yeah.
And again, that's a simplification, but it anyway. So, and the other remarkable thing I would add about all of these isms and all of these ologies and all of these cults and all of these sects and schisms and breakaways and so on, people are really only telling like two or three stories.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, it's extremely complicated, but it's also extremely simple. And what's the simple story basically is people, they don't understand why they have to die. They don't understand like why terrible things are always happening. Why do good people suffer? Who is good? Um, that's like six or seven subjects. There's probably three or four more about sex, but then that kind of exhausts it.
Yeah.
It's hard to be human. It's just really, really hard.
I agree. But on that kind of bombshell, if you like, Arthur, you've been a fantastic guest. I've loved chatting to you about all that stuff. Generally thrilled. I'm always happy after reading someone's books to get their kind of get the background to them and stuff like that. So you've been absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much, Arthur.
And thank you for having me. I've enjoyed talking to you.
Brilliant. Listen, don't go just yet though, because
Okay.
I have a tradition where I close it out. I get a quick snap of the two of us together for this idea I have for a kind of a wall thing where I have all my guests on it. But that's for
Uh-huh.
the future. But I'll close it out anyways, and then we'll have a chat after. All right.
Okay.
Thanks, Arthur. Okay, I also want to thank John Francis for doing all of the tech stuff for me. I always thank my mum, my dad, granddad, Jaron Calvin for the music and the logo. We're on YouTube. Subscribe if you would. Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and then all the podcast platforms. You can get Arthur's books online, by the way. I don't know if you get them over here. Maybe you would. I'm not too sure, Arthur. But I do know that I've read them, so they're available. So yeah, people go out and get them. I would recommend them wholeheartedly, and you should have even more reason to read them after listening to Arthur chat. So anyway, thanks everyone for watching or for listening wherever you did. And obviously, we will be back next week. Once again, Arthur, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone. Bye.